There is a document. It was written on the night of January 27th, 1986, the night before the Challenger launched. In this document, an engineer named Roger Boisjoly wrote that if the shuttle launched the next morning, it would explode. He did not guess this. He did not worry about it. He knew it. He had the data, he had the calculations, he had months of warnings that nobody had listened to. That night, he sat in a conference room in Utah and begged NASA to stop the launch. NASA said no. The next morning, Roger Boisjoly stood outside and watched Challenger lift off into the coldest sky in Florida history. 73 seconds later, it was gone. 7 astronauts, gone. And Roger Boisjoly stood there, in the cold, knowing that he had tried. That document he wrote is still there today. You can read it, every word. He wrote it the night before, and nobody listened. This is not a story about an explosion. You already know about the explosion. This is a story about the night before, about the phone calls and the arguments and the moment when the people who knew looked at the people who decided and said, please, do not do this, about what happened when they said no. Stay with me. January 27th, 1986, Tuesday. In a small town in New Hampshire, a woman named Christa McAuliffe was grading papers. She was a high school social studies teacher, 37 years old, 2 kids, Scott and Caroline, a husband named Steve, a house with a garden, a job she loved. 9 months earlier, she had been selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first civilian ever to fly in space. She was going to teach 2 lessons from orbit, live, to students across America watching in their classrooms. She called it the ultimate field trip. On the night of January 27th, she was at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida with the rest of the crew, waiting for tomorrow. The launch had already been delayed twice. Once on the 25th because of weather in Spain, where an emergency landing site was located, once on the 26th because of a broken hatch bolt. The crew had been ready to go, and then not, and then ready again. Christa McAuliffe called her mother that evening. She told her she was ready, that she was excited, that tomorrow was finally the day. Her mother said, "I am so proud of you." Christa said, "I know." She did not know that 11 engineers in Utah were at that very moment fighting to keep her on the ground. In Brigham City, Utah, at the offices of Morton Thiokol, the company that built the rocket boosters for the space shuttle, a group of engineers had been awake since morning. The weather forecast for Cape Canaveral the next day was unlike anything they had ever seen for a launch. The overnight temperature was going to drop to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 27 degrees below freezing. For most people, that is just a cold night. For Roger Boisjoly, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Roger Boisjoly was a mechanical engineer, quiet, careful, the kind of man who checked everything twice and then checked it again. He had spent years working on the O-rings, the rubber seals that held the sections of the solid rocket boosters together. In the summer of 1985, 6 months before this night, he had written a memo to his supervisors. He wrote that the O-rings were showing dangerous erosion on flights in cold weather. He wrote that if the problem was not fixed, there would be, and he used these exact words, a catastrophic failure. Nobody fixed it. He wrote another memo. He went to meetings. He showed his data to anyone who would look. Nobody acted. And now, it was January 27th, 1986, the night before the coldest launch in the history of the space program, and Roger Boisjoly was about to make one final attempt to stop it. At 8:15 in the evening, a teleconference began. On one side of the call, Morton Thiokol engineers in Utah, including Roger Boisjoly. On the other side, NASA managers at Kennedy Space Center in Florida and Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. The engineers had prepared charts, data, photographs of O-ring damage from previous cold weather flights. The evidence was clear, at least to them. The colder the temperature, the worse the O-ring damage. At 18 degrees, the O-rings would not seal properly. Hot gas from inside the booster would leak through. And then, Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson went through the data point by point. NASA, was not convinced. A manager at Marshall Space Flight Center named Lawrence Malloy responded with words that became infamous. He said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" He said it like the engineers were being unreasonable, like the data was an inconvenience. Another NASA manager said that the Thiokol engineers were trying to establish a new launch commit criterion, meaning he thought they were moving the goalposts, changing the rules last minute. What the engineers were doing was reading the data and telling the truth. Roger Boisjoly later described what happened next as the worst moment of his professional life. Morton Thiokol's management asked NASA for 5 minutes to caucus offline, to talk among themselves. During those 5 minutes, the engineers argued. Boisjoly showed his charts again. Thompson hit the table with his hand, trying to make the point. The engineers knew what the data said. Then, a Thiokol vice president named Jerry Mason said something that Boisjoly never forgot. He said, "We have to make a management decision." He asked only the managers to vote, not the engineers, the managers. Joe Kilminster, the program manager, signed the recommendation to launch. Roger Boisjoly watched him sign it. He later said, "I had done all I could do. I argued and I pleaded. I had nothing left." The teleconference ended. NASA had its approval. The launch was on for the morning. Boisjoly went home that night knowing what he knew. He did not sleep. He lay in bed and thought about the O-rings, about the temperature forecast, about the charts he had shown and the arguments he had made, and the moment he had watched his manager sign that paper. He was not panicking. He was not irrational. He was an engineer reading data, and the data said that in the morning, 7 people were going to die. He could not stop it. His colleague, Arnie Thompson, also went home that night. He sat at his kitchen table and could not eat dinner. His wife asked him what was wrong. He said he could not talk about it, not because it was classified, but because he did not know how to say what he was feeling, that in the morning, something terrible was going to happen. And he had tried to stop it, and failed. At the Kennedy Space Center, the crew of Challenger had no idea any of this was happening. They had not been told about the teleconference. They had not been told about the O-ring concerns. They had not been told that their own manufacturer's engineers had argued against the launch. Commander Dick Scobee was 46 years old. He had been a test pilot, a Vietnam veteran, a man who had spent his career chasing the edge of what was possible. He had flown Challenger once before. He was ready. Pilot Michael Smith was flying in space for the first time. He was from Beaufort, North Carolina. 3 kids. His family had driven to Florida to watch the launch. Judith Resnik was a mission specialist, an electrical engineer, one of the first American women in space. She kept the photo of her dog in her locker on the shuttle. Ellison Onizuka was the first Asian American in space. He was from a small coffee farming community in Hawaii. He had promised the kids at his old elementary school that he would carry their school patch into orbit. Ronald McNair was a physicist, a black belt in karate. He had planned to play a saxophone piece in orbit, the first music ever recorded in space. Gregory Jarvis was a payload specialist from Hughes Aircraft. He had been bumped from 2 previous flights by politicians who wanted to fly in his seat. This was finally his turn. And Christa McAuliffe, the teacher, 37 years old, grading papers in her hotel room, waiting for tomorrow. None of them knew. None of them had any idea. The morning of January 28th arrived cold, colder than any launch morning in the history of the space program. Overnight, the temperature at Kennedy Space Center had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice had formed on the launch structure. Icicles hung from the service tower. Ground crews had worked through the night trying to clear them. Workers were sent out to the launch pad that morning to photograph the ice. The photographs were sent to NASA engineers for evaluation. The launch had already been pushed back from 9:38 a.m. to 11:38 a.m. to give the ice more time to melt. In Utah, Roger Boisjoly woke up and knew it was launch day. He drove to work. He sat at his desk. He could not concentrate. In Florida, the crew was being helped into their suits. Christa McAuliffe smiled for photographs with her crewmates. She had been doing interviews all week. Every newspaper in America had run a story about the teacher going to space. Her students at Concord High School in New Hampshire were gathered in the gymnasium, watching on a television that had been set up for the occasion. Her parents were in the stands at Kennedy Space Center. Her children, Scott, who was 9, and Caroline, who was 6, were watching from somewhere close by. It was a Tuesday morning in January. It was supposed to be the greatest day of her life. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The engines ignited. Challenger lifted off the pad. The crowd cheered. In classrooms across America, children cheered. In the stands, Christa McAuliffe's parents reached for each other's hands. In Utah, Roger Boisjoly watched the launch on a television in the conference room. He sat very still. He watched the shuttle climb. He watched it go higher. He counted the seconds. At 59 seconds, he thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the O-rings held. At 72 seconds, the shuttle was 46,000 feet in the air, moving at nearly twice the speed of sound. At 73 seconds, a puff of smoke appeared from the right solid rocket booster. Then a flash. Then the shuttle broke apart. In the conference room in Utah, Roger Boisjoly watched it happen. He did not move. He did not speak. He just sat and watched the smoke trails spread across the sky. He had known. He had tried. Nobody had listened. In the stands at Kennedy Space Center, it took a moment for people to understand what they were seeing. The shuttle had disappeared into 2 white smoke trails spreading slowly apart in the blue sky. Some people thought it was planned, a stage separation maybe. Then the NASA announcer said, "Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation." And the crowd understood. Christa McAuliffe's parents were still holding each other's hands. Her father put his face in his hands. Her mother stood and stared at the sky for a long time, not moving. In Concord, New Hampshire, in the school gymnasium, the students were watching the television. They saw the same thing. A teacher who was not supposed to be there, because teachers stay in classrooms, had gone somewhere no teacher had ever gone, and she was gone. One of her students later said, "We did not cry right away. We just looked at the screen and then at each other. We were waiting for someone to tell us it was okay, that she was okay. Nobody told them that, because it was not okay." The crew cabin of Challenger survived the initial explosion. It separated from the rest of the orbiter and continued upward for a few seconds before beginning to fall. It fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before hitting the Atlantic Ocean at nearly 200 miles per hour. NASA investigators later found that at least 3 of the crew members had activated their personal emergency air packs after the explosion. This could only have been done manually, which means at least 3 of them were alive after the explosion. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they fell. What they knew and what they felt and what they said to each other, if anything, in those final moments is something the world will never know. The cabin hit the ocean. It was over. Roger Boisjoly testified before the Presidential Commission that investigated the disaster. He told them everything: the memos, the teleconference, the charts. The moment he watched his manager sign the launch recommendation. He told the truth. His company never forgave him for it. He was isolated, removed from the Challenger investigation team, given nothing to do. His colleagues stopped talking to him. He was pushed out. He eventually left Morton Thiokol. He spent the rest of his life giving talks at universities and engineering schools about professional ethics, about what happens when you tell the truth and nobody listens, about what it means to be responsible for a decision you tried to prevent. He said, "I have to live with the fact that I knew, that I tried, and that 7 people died anyway." He said that it never went away. He died in 2012. His memos are still in the NASA archives. You can read them today. Every word. The investigation revealed what Roger Boisjoly had known all along. The O-rings had failed exactly as he predicted. In the cold, they had lost their elasticity. They had not sealed properly. Hot gas had leaked through. It had burned through the booster casing and ignited the external fuel tank. The cause of the disaster was not a mystery. It was not unforeseeable. It was in a memo written 6 months earlier by a man sitting at his desk who looked at the data and told the truth. NASA had known about the O-ring problem since 1977, 9 years before the disaster. There had been 15 flights that showed O-ring erosion before Challenger, 15 warnings. But the program had pressure on it. There was a launch schedule to keep. There was a teacher to put in space. There was a State of the Union address that night, and President Reagan had planned to mention Christa McAuliffe by name. The pressure to launch was everywhere. The one voice that said stop was not enough. Dick Scobee's wife June kept his belongings exactly as they were for years. His flight suit, his logbooks, the notes on his desk. She spent the rest of her life working on space education programs. She said he would have wanted that. Christa McAuliffe's husband Steve raised her 2 children alone, Scott and Caroline. He never remarried. Her students at Concord High School graduated the following year. They dedicated their yearbook to her. The gymnasium where they watched the launch was renamed in her honor. Her parents, who stood in the stands and held each other's hands and watched the sky, lived long lives. Her mother, Grace, was still giving interviews about her daughter decades later. She said, "I still talk to her, every day." Ellison Onizuka's school patch, the one he had promised the kids in Hawaii he would carry to space, was recovered from the ocean floor. It had made it further than he had. Ronald McNair's saxophone never got played in orbit. His brother Carl later started a community program in his name. The program helped young people from underserved communities get into science and technology. As of today, it has served millions of students. Gregory Jarvis, who had been bumped from 2 previous flights by politicians, finally got his turn. It was the last turn he ever got. We remember Challenger as a story of an explosion, of a Tuesday morning that turned to smoke, of a teacher who became something far larger than she had ever expected. But it is also a story about the night before. About a man sitting in a conference room in Utah with data in his hands and fear in his chest, looking at the people who held the decision and saying, "Please, do not do this." About the moment when the people who knew looked at the people who decided, and the people who decided said, "We are launching in the morning." About what it costs to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it. Roger Boisjoly spent the rest of his life asking a question he could not answer. He asked, "What more could I have done?" The honest answer is nothing. He did everything a person can do. He wrote the memos, he showed the data, he argued and pleaded and begged, and then he watched it happen anyway. There are names on the wall: Dick Scobee, Michael Smith, Judith Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Christa McAuliffe. 7 people who woke up on January 28, 1986 and went to work. 7 people who did not know that the night before, a man who knew the truth had tried to save them. 7 people who trusted that the people making decisions were listening to the people who knew. They were not. Hold that thought the next time someone tells you the data does not matter. The next time someone tells you to be a team player. The next time someone tells you the schedule is more important than the risk. Roger Boisjoly was a team player. He played the only way he knew how. He told the truth. And he had to live with what happened next for the rest of his life.